Hello everybody, Jade Harrison here again, and happy So Blue Dolly Sunday to you. This is Maddie. For those of you who haven't met her yet, she is a limited edition Ariel Disney Princess Build-A-Bear. She's this beautiful sort of the sea at dawn blue with these amazing turquoise eyes. And because So Blue Dolly Sunday now includes green and purple, she's wearing this beautiful jade green and white strappy romper that is up to 1 month size. It's got a little balloon sleeved. I don't know if that's the correct term, but that's the one I'm going with. Vest underneath. It's from Next. I managed to get it in the sale. I don't often buy new stuff for the Cubs, but I saw this and a few other things, and I was absolutely besotted. Maddie, because of being a few soup screens, so when I saw this, I couldn't wait to get it on her. So Blue Dolly Sunday is run by the wonderful Tamara at Once Upon a Nursery. She is an amazing lady. If you haven't subscribed to her already, please do. She will make your day. She's lovely. She's full of fun. She's, always trying to bring people together. And she's just a lovely person to spend some time with. So do check her out if you haven't already. I will also be continuing to read our story for the moment, which is Nigel Hinson's Buddy. As per all videos where I read, all copyright goes to Nigel Hinson and to Penguin. I own absolutely nothing, and this is for entertainment. I'm not trying to do any video out of anything. Grab a hot drink if you've got one. Make yourself nice and comfy, particularly if you're in the UK. Grab yourself an extra blanket just so you don't get chill up. And we'll start. We're on chapter 9. His dad went out again that night and the next night too. But he tried not to worry, but it was hard, and he was glad when Monday came and there was school to think about. The twins, Julius in particular, were still going on about the house at Croxley Street, but Buddy didn't take much notice. It all seemed silly compared with other things. Mr. Worthington was away again on the Monday, but on the Tuesday he was back. At the end of the morning registration, he stopped Buddy on the way out of the classroom. "Now, lad, that's a bit more like it, isn't it?" he said, nodding at Buddy's trousers. Buddy was ashamed at how much pleasure he got from this word of approval. He didn't like Mr. Normington, but he deliberately waited until most people had left the room and then walked past the teacher's desk, hoping that he'd noticed. "The bag still makes you look a bit of a scruff, though," Mr. Normington added. That bag still makes you look a bit of a scruff, though," Mr. Normington added, pointing to the plastic bag. Buddy's face burned with embarrassment, especially when David Siddell and Emma Groves went by, having My old man's a dustman. Sorry, I should have clarified this when the song was previously mentioned, but My Old Man's Dustman was a song by a British skiffle artist, which was kind of skiffle was kind of a cross between folk, rock and roll, and kind of sort of DIY bedroom stuff. Basically, a whole bunch of teenagers got their mum's washboards out their laundry rooms, and made bases out of tea chests and formed bands. John Lennon was one such. He formed a band called the Quarrymen because he and all his mates went to Quarry Bank Secondary School, and Lonnie Donegan was one of the big heroes of the skiffle movement. And My Old Man's Dustman, along with Rock Island Line, which is a cover of an early American hit. I don't know who the original artist of that was. I will look it up and I will get back to you. But yeah, My Old Man's Dustman, Rock Island Line, and another song called Does Your Chewing Gum Lose Its Flavour on the Bedpost Overnight, which is about as weird as it sounds. Basically, My Man's Dustman is just a song, a slightly comic song about a guy who works on the council rubbish lorries. But David Siddell and Emma Groves, being the idiots that they are, have decided to use it as a dig about Buddy being working class. But yeah, if you do get a chance to look Lonnie Donegan up, do. He bless him, he was a really great performer. He's passed away now, but he was a really great performer, and he clearly enjoyed every minute of it. So do look him up if you can. Still, any improvement is better than none, Mr. Norrington said, and casually tapped him on the side of the head with a book as a sign for him to go. Out in the corridor, Buddy caught up with David Siddell and Emma Groves. He got hold of Siddell's shoulder and swung him round. Just watch it, Siddell. As soon as he spoke, Buddy realised he could make a mistake. What could he say? Don't sing that song? It would sound ridiculous. Watch what? Siddell said, and brushed his shoulder as if Buddy's hands had been filthy. They're so violent, aren't they? Emma Groves said, as if Buddy was some kind of primitive animal. Buddy hated her piercing, snobby voice. He felt like punching her stupid round face and sending her back to her precious family with a black eye and a squat nose. Just watch it, that's all, he said feebly, and started down the corridor. Siddell stuck out his foot, and Buddy tripped over it. He stumbled, but stopped himself from falling, then swung round, whirling his plastic bag in the direction of Siddell's head. Siddell was too quick, though. He grabbed the plastic bag with his free hand and jabbed his black briefcase hard into Buddy's stomach with the other. Buddy fell against the wall, gasping for breath. The plastic bag ripped and all his books fell to the floor. He was left leaning against the wall with just the tattered ends of the white plastic in his hands. Emma Groves' laughter floated back along the corridor. Oh, that's a bit mean, isn't it, Paddy? It's not nice to laugh at people and be cruel like that, is it? No, that Emma Groves sounds a bit of a one, as my English teacher used to say. Um, I went to school with one or two girls like her. Spoiler alert, they weren't particularly nice. He brooded over it all morning. It served him right for wanting Mr. Normington to notice his trousers. But the really sickening thing was that he wanted a proper school bag more than ever. He told himself he didn't care what Sid Dale and Mr. Normington thought, but it wasn't true. As soon as he got home from school, he took out the 10 quid his dad had given him and went to the shops. He bought a big red canvas shoulder bag. He'd still be different from Siddell and that crowd with their hard black briefcases. He didn't want to be like them. But at least Mr. Normington couldn't call him a scruff now. His dad stayed at home on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, and Buddy felt much happier. Apart from the fact that the house was lonely and scary when his dad was there, he half hoped the work had stopped. It would mean an end to the money, of course, but it would be worth it if it ended the worry. On Thursday, though, his dad went out, and the worrying began again. Then on Friday morning, there was a discussion in the general studies lesson about crime. Buddy tried to close his ears, but he couldn't stop hearing things people said. They were going on about how criminals should be made to pay with long prison sentences, and that prisons should be like the old days with chains and whips. Some people even suggested that thieves ought to have their hands cut off, like in some Arab countries. The crazy thing was that a lot of these opinions came from people who Buddy knew had nicked things from shops, as if they didn't realise that they were thieves too. And it was also obvious that they never had to worry about their dads going to prison. Buddy felt uneasy and depressed for the rest of the day. He didn't even enjoy the satellite club that evening. In fact, he left early and hurried home to check whether his dad was in. Luckily, he was, lying on the sofa, listening to records. As Buddy came in through the door, though, his dad jumped as if startled and slid something behind a cushion. Buddy pretended not to notice, but as soon as his dad left the room, he went over and felt behind the cushion. He found a photograph of his mum. When he got to bed, he couldn't sleep. The photo must mean that his dad still missed her. They never mentioned her, but Buddy had never stopped thinking about her. Sometimes he daydreamed about her coming back. Once, he'd nearly asked his dad for her new address so he could go and talk to her. In the end, he hadn't, partly because he thought his dad would be angry or upset, but mainly because he'd feel too ashamed to face her. He knew now, of course, that it couldn't have been all his fault. There must have been other things wrong. That's why his mum and dad had argued so much. But the money he'd stolen from her purse had been the thing that finally made her leave. Perhaps if he hadn't done that, she would still be here and his dad wouldn't have to look secretly at her photo. What was she doing? Did she still work as a secretary in that office? Perhaps he could wait outside the building one evening to see her come out. Did she think about him sometimes? Did she hate him? The thoughts kept him awake for ages, and he slept till nearly 11 o'clock the next morning. His dad was already up and getting ready to go out. "Meeting someone," he said. "Won't be back till late. Need any money?" Buddy shook his head, but his dad put 5 quid on the table anyway. After his dad left, the house seemed empty and depressing. He turned the radio up loud while he had some breakfast, and then went upstairs to get dressed. Although it was daytime, he was suddenly scared. He kept feeling as if there was somebody behind him, and he bent down and checked there was nobody under the bed. He wasn't due at the twins' house till 2, but he decided to leave early. Better to take his time walking rather than stay here alone. He switched off the radio and stood for a moment in the silence, then dashed along the corridor and out the front door. As soon as he was outside, he felt better. He walked slowly along the roads in the sunshine and could laugh at himself for having been so scared. Mrs. Ribeiro was, as usual, at the desk when Buddy walked into the office. She was talking on the phone, but she waved at him and pointed to the back room. "Buddy, you'll never guess what!" Julius shouted as soon as he saw him. "Shush!" Charmian said quickly and leapt up to make sure the door to the office was properly closed. "What is it?" Buddy whispered, and his heart began to race. "We had a phone call this morning," Julius began. "Keep your voice down, Jules," Charmian hissed, and pulled them both into the kitchen before she went on. "Mum was out shopping, so we had to look after the office. I was on the phone taking the messages, and Julius was on the radio to the taxis, and she forgot to take the address, and—" Julius broke in. Charmian put her hand over Julius's mouth. "I'm telling it. Someone rang for a taxi, and I forgot to ask them for their address. And then she said I'd have to answer if they rang up again," Julius said, breaking free of Charmian. "But I told her to get lost. Jules, please let me tell it." Okay, just get on with it," Julius said, sitting on the table, out of reach of his sister. "Anyway," Charmian went on, "Jules said he wouldn't answer if they rang back. So when the phone went a couple of minutes later, I had to pick it up. I was all ready to apologise, but it wasn't the same person. It was someone else asking for a taxi to go to the docks. Well, after the last one, I wasn't going to make the same mistake, so I asked for the address." Charmian paused dramatically. It was 56 Croxley Street. Buddy felt the hair rise on the back of his neck, and he looked at Julius, who nodded and said, "It's true, I heard it. I thought I was hearing things, so I asked the man to repeat it, and Jules listened in." "What did you do?" Buddy asked. "Right, now it's my bit," Julius began, jumping off the table and almost acting out the story. "So I called the taxis, see? Everyone was busy except Delgado, so he went. Then, about half an hour later, Delgado dropped in here to say he was going to have a couple of hours break. So I thought I'd ask him some questions, all casual like." "You should have seen him," Charmian laughed. "He thinks he's a real movie detective. Get lost! I had to be careful, or he'd have got suspicious. Anyway, I found out loads. Dell picked up this bloke outside number 56. He was waiting on the pavement. A short bloke, very fat, black coat, white hair and thick glasses. He was carrying a suitcase. Dell helped him with it, and it weighed a ton. He went to the docks and got out at a pub. Don't you think it's great? I told you there was something weird going on. but you two wouldn't listen. Buddy had to admit the whole thing was a strange coincidence, and there were all sorts of mysteries, such as what was in the case and why was there a phone in a house all boarded up. On the other hand, he couldn't really share the excitement that even Charmian seemed to feel. After all, what could they do? There was no stopping Julius, though. He wanted to go back to Croxley Street and see if they could find out more. Charmian agreed, saying that there wasn't much else to do and it might be good fun. They both nagged him until he said he'd go with them, but he wasn't happy about it. There was something about that house that scared him, something that reminded him about all his fears of death. In some strange way, the house was dangerous. Chapter 10. Even in the daytime, 56 Croxley Street looked sinister. It was built of dark stone that had been stained darker in places where rain had dripped down from the broken gutters. From the grey slates of the roof down to the ground, there was no lightness or colour anywhere. The trees and bushes in the garden were a miserable dark green that seemed to swallow up the light. But he noticed that when the branches of one of the bushes leaned against the stone of the house, the leaves had died as though poisoned by its touch. The worst thing of all were the boards on the windows. They were what made the place look so gloomy and lifeless, and anyone could be inside, peering out through the cracks. Buddy stepped back behind the large brick gatepost. "Now what?" he said. "There's nothing to see. How about going round the back?" No, Jules," Charmian said at once, grabbing hold of her brother's arm. "Why not? We might get caught, that's why. Tell him, Buddy." "Well, I'm not going," Buddy said. "The whole place gives me the creeps. I told you it wasn't worth coming." "You two are just scared," Julius said, then jerked his arm free. He darted away through dirt. "You two are just scared," Julius said, then jerked his arm free. He darted away through the gate and into the garden. "Julius!" Charmian called out, but there was no answer. "Honestly, that kid! Come on, you can't let him go alone." She peered round the gatepost, then ran into the garden. Buddy hesitated. If it were any other house, he wouldn't have minded. It could be good fun sneaking into back gardens. He'd done it loads of times when he was a kid. But this house... Anyway, he didn't feel like a kid anymore. Julius had been right. He was scared. Nowadays, he was worried and scared half the time. So there was no pleasure in scaring himself on purpose. Suddenly, Julius came dashing out the gate. He pushed Buddy back against the gatepost and burst out laughing. "Some old bird's caught Charmian." "What?" "I was hiding inside the hedge here, and she went belting past looking for me. Then this old lady opened the window." "In the house?" "Nowhere. Next door." Buddy peeped round the gatepost. Charmian was standing at the entrance to the dark alleyway that led towards the back garden of number 56. She was looking up at the side wall of the house next door. There was an open window, and Buddy could see that lace curtains had been pulled aside, but he couldn't see who was there. Charmian said something, pointed out to the road, then nodded. She glanced quickly down the side of number 56 and ran towards the gate. "Where were you?" she said angrily to Julius. "Behind the hedge. Did she tell you off?" Charmian shook her head. She wants to tell me something. You're not going, are you? Buddy asked. She said it was important. As Charmian started along the pavement, Julius raised his arms wide and looked at Buddy in disbelief. When Charmian reached the gate of 54, she turned and beckoned to them. "She's nuts," Julius said. Buddy waited a moment, hoping that she'd change her mind. But when she signalled again and went through the gate, he and Julius followed. As they scrambled up the tall flight of steps to the front door, Charmian was already ringing the bell. "What does she want?" Buddy asked, hoping that it would turn out to be something harmless, like an errand that she needed done. "I don't know. She asked me if I like cats, and then she said she had something important to say. Yeah, probably wants you to clear up some cat's mess on her carpet," Julius said. Charmian rang the bell again. In the silence after the bell, they could hear squeaking noises coming towards them along the corridor. "Sounds as if she needs oiling," Julius whispered, and they all started to giggle. "Shh," Charmian said, trying to control herself, but that made her giggle even more. There was the sound of 3 bolts being drawn slowly back, and then the rattle of a chain. This was too much for Julius, who started to snort and choke. The the door swung open slowly to reveal an old lady in a wheelchair. Buddy was aware of 3 pairs of eyes, the pale blue ones of the old lady and the large green ones of 2 black cats on her lap. The old lady's eyes flicked nervously from Buddy to the twins, then past them in the direction of number 56. A terrible stench of fish wafted out the door, and Buddy glanced along the corridor to the filthy-looking kitchen at the end. The floor was covered with rubbish, and there was a large saucepan bubbling away on the stove. "You're the ones who were round here the other night, aren't you?" The, "You're the ones who were round here the other night, aren't you?" the old lady suddenly whispered hoarsely. Buddy started to deny it, but Charmian nodded. "Yes, well, you're very silly children," the old lady went on, her voice rising angrily. "You could get yourselves hurt, you know. I was going to warn you then, but I never open my door at night. Old people like me get mugged every day. Worse than that sometimes." There was a splutter from Julius, and he ducked behind Charmian to hide. The old lady turned on him angrily. "Don't you snigger, young man. You'll laugh on the other side of your face if he caught you in his garden." "Who?" Charmian asked. "The beast, that's who. It's nearly 4. Time for his walk. He ought to be under lock and key, not walking the streets. This used to be a nice neighbourhood before they let him loose to frighten us all. They ought to put him back before he kills someone." The lady's voice was so fierce that even Julius stopped laughing. He glanced across towards the next house and then back to the old lady, as if he wasn't quite sure whether she was serious or not. Buddy wasn't sure either. It sounded weird, but there wasn't a trace of a joke in her voice. "What does he do?" Julius said. Go and find out if you think it's so funny," she snapped. "He strangles cats, and he'd probably do the same to you. And good riddance." There was an awkward silence after this outburst. Then Charmian spoke. My brother didn't mean to laugh. He just gets giggly." The old lady shrugged sulkily. but the apology seemed to have calmed her down. Did he really strangle cats? Charmian asked. He killed my Katerina, didn't he? Out there, she pointed down the alleyway. Then he held up her poor little body to taunt me. I saw him from my window. I see everything from there. I know what goes on. He'd kill Ida and Grace too if I give him half the chance. But Mummy won't let him, will she, my lovelies? She said, lifting the two cats and kissing their... Buddy could see Julius biting his lip, desperately trying not to smile. Why didn't you tell the police? She asked. Pooh, the police. What do they care? I rang them when those lazy dustmen kept dropping rubbish down my path. What did they do? Nothing. Too busy, they said. But this is different. Killing a cat, that's awful. The old lady's face softened, and she smiled up at Charmian, showing her yellowy false teeth. There, I knew you'd understand. We know straight away when somebody loves us, don't we, my lovelies? Yes, we do. Say hello to the nice young lady, girls. She held up the two cats and waggled their paws. This is Grace, and this is Ida, and I'm Mrs. Solomon. Charmian shook hands and told Mrs. Solomon her name. The old lady smiled and gushed on about how pleased she was, but when Buddy and Julius introduced herself, she nodded briefly without a smile and turned back to talk to Charmian. Julius raised his eyebrows at Buddy to show what he thought, then leaned against the porch wall. Buddy went down a couple of steps and peered down along the passageway towards the back garden of number 56. There was an area of cracked, uneven concrete near the end of the alley, and beyond that, long, unkempt grass and overgrown bushes. That were as neglected as the house. Charmian was now crouching down, stroking the cats, while Mrs. Solomon told her what they liked to eat and what funny tricks they got up to. Julius yawned loudly and tapped his feet against the wall. Buddy was just about to sit down on the edge of the steps when a tall finger turned the corner from the back of number 56. He jumped on the porch and whispered urgently, It's him! That beast person! I told you! Every day at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Solomon said triumphantly. There was the sound of dragging footsteps. Then the man came into view. The porch was so high that even though he was very tall, they were all looking down on his head. It was impossible to see what he looked like because he was wearing an old-fashioned leather cap with a large peak and ear flaps that covered the sides of his face. He walked slowly, his shoulders hunched and his hands thrust deep into his long black overcoat. As the man shuffled towards the front gate, Buddy was startled by a shout from Mrs. Solomon. Murderer! The man stopped and slowly turned towards them. The white face and the dark ringed eyes were unmistakable. It was the man they'd seen through the letterbox. He opened his mouth to say something, but Mrs. Solomon didn't give her a chance. I saw you, she shouted. I know all about you. Don't think I don't. Comings and goings in the middle of the night, killing innocent animals. Beast! The man's mouth moved, but no sound came out. He stayed like that for a moment, then made his way out of the gate and along the road. "Does he live on his own?" Julius asked, when the man finally went out of sight behind a distant hedge. "Who'd live with him?" Mrs. Solomon asked crossly. Then she took Charmian's hand and said in a much gentler voice, "I told you he'd come, didn't I? And so don't you go hanging round there any more. Especially not at night. It's not safe for a young girl like you." Julius looked at Buddy and flicked his eyes quickly in the direction of the road. "Well, we'd better go now," he said casually. Mrs. Solomon must have heard, but she didn't even glance at them. So Buddy followed Julius down the steps, and out onto the pavement. When they looked back, Charmian was still talking to Mrs. Solomon, far off, down near the end of the road, but he could just make out the figure of the beast. "What about going round the back now he's out?" Julius asked. "Come on, it'll be a laugh." The same idea had occurred to Buddy, except it wasn't for a laugh. What Mrs. Solomon had said about comings and goings in the night had started his brain racing. Something that had been nagging away at the back of his mind suddenly became clear. Somehow or other, the mystery of his dad's work could be tied up with this house. Now he'd made the connection, but he couldn't understand why he hadn't seen it before. It was so obvious. His dad had mentioned the house the same night he'd first talked about the job. It wasn't the sort of story you came out with like that, not unless someone had told it to you. So who would have told his dad the story? The same person who'd offered him the work, of course. It could just be a coincidence, and he hoped it was, but either way, he had to find out. Now was the perfect opportunity, and the last thing he wanted was for Julius to go charging in there on his own. "Okay, but we better wait till Charmian comes." "Great stuff," Julius said, then called, "Get a move on, Char." Charmian waved her hand in acknowledgement, then bent down and gave the cats a final stroke. Mrs. Solomon said something before wheeling her chair backwards and closing the door. But he could hear all the locks being turned and the chains being replaced. "What's the big hurry?" Charmian said when she came through the gate. "We're going in there while the beast's out," Buddy said, and he and Julius ran along the pavement and into the garden of number 56 before she had the chance to argue. Chapter 11. The back of the house was as dreary as the front, even though the stonework had been painted white at one time. Damp had risen from the ground and stained the peeling paint with a green mould. The 3 steps that led down to the back door were shiny with damp. To the right of the door was a window that, like those at the front, had been boarded up. Just to the left of the door, though, about 7 feet from the ground, was a small window that not only had boards on it, but was actually half open. Bunny took a couple of steps backwards, then ran and jumped. He caught hold of the windowsill. "Give me a bunker." "Bunny, don't!" Charmian called. "Look, stop moaning," groaned Julius as he took hold of Buddy's legs and pushed him upwards. "If you're going to stay here, belt up or go back and talk to that old crone. Buddy swung the window outwards and hauled himself up until his head and shoulders were through the hole. He was now blocking most of the light, but he could see that the small room had been some kind of larder. There were shelves on the left and a door to the right, which must lead into the corridor next to the back door. "Okay, Jules, let go. I'll go in and open the back door." He kicked his legs and started to squirm through. It was a tight squeeze and he grazed his shin, but finally he managed to pull his body through. Balancing with one hand on the shelf and the other on the window ledge, he jumped to the floor. His leg stung like mad. He lifted his jeans and wiped a trickle of blood from the graze. He was just reaching for the doorknob when it started to turn. He sprang round and leapt for the window. His hand slipped and he tumbled backwards onto the floor. Julius was grinning down at him. The back door was unlocked. Buddy took a few seconds to get his breath back, then let Julius pull him to his feet. He followed him out into the corridor, where Charmian was slowly opening another door opposite. The room was in semi-darkness because of the boards on the window. Buddy tried the switch just inside the door, but no light came on. In the corner near the window, he could just make out an old-fashioned, shallow stone sink into which a tap dripped softly. Across along the far wall, an ancient gas stove lay on its side, as if someone had disconnected it and let it drop. "This must be where he sleeps," Charmian said in a rather scared voice. Duddy turned and looked at the camp bed that stood against the wall behind the door. There were a couple of blankets on it and a rolled-up sweater that obviously served as a pillow. All along the bed stood candles of various sizes. Was the beast scared of the dark? At the far end of the bed was a pile of cans. Charmian went over and peered down at them. Stewed steak, potatoes, peas, potato salad. You must eat them cold, she said, picking up a half-empty can with a fork in it. She shivered and put it down. "Do you think he stays here all the time?" Julius whispered. "Dunno. Let's have a look at the rest of the house." Buddy turned and hit his knee on the edge of a door. His leg was going to be in a bad state by the end of the day. There was another empty cupboard next to the larder, then 3 steps that led up to the main part of the house. Buddy walked up them and gently opened the door at the top. There was a large, tiled entrance hall and a wide staircase leading upstairs. Buddy glanced up the stairs, then crossed the hall to the front door. This was where the beast had been that night he'd looked through the letterbox. The front room on the right of the hall was a mess. The wallpaper was hanging off the walls, and there were chunks of fallen plaster on the floor. The room was on the left of the hall. On the left of the hall, though, looked as though someone had swept it recently. It was completely empty, except that in the middle of the bare floorboards there was a telephone. "Who put it there?" Charmian asked. "Why have one at all?" Julius answered. "The whole place is weird. I wonder where he killed her." Buddy had been so concerned about looking for any sign that might connect his dad with the house that he'd completely forgotten about the murder. He suddenly found himself peering at the floorboards as if he might find bloodstains on them. Julius led the way up the staircase to the first floor. Buddy and Charmian stopped halfway and looked over the banister to the hall below. There was a chink of glass, and Buddy glanced up and saw Julius stumble. A bottle shot out from under his foot and came tumbling towards them. Buddy tried to stop it, but it caught the edge of the stair above him and flipped over his hand. It sailed in a high arc and shattered on the tiles of the hall. The crash could have been heard out in the street. In the silence afterwards, they all held their breath. "Blimey, this is scary," Julius said at last. "Let's have a quick look and then get out." All 5 rooms were empty. The dust choked Buddy's nose, and the dark corners of the rooms gave him the shivers. Once, when he stood still, he could hear soft rustlings under the floorboards. Buddy was all prepared to go when Charmian opened a small door next to the bathroom and found a narrow staircase. The stairs curved up to an attic even, with steep sloping ceilings. Julius pointed to a large hook screwed into the beam that ran from one end of the room to another. He didn't need to say anything. They were all thinking the same thing. Perhaps this was where the man had hanged himself. Despite these thoughts about the house's past, though, Buddy felt pleased. This was the last room, and he hadn't seen a sign that there was anything suspicious going on. True, it was a bit strange for someone to live in one dirty room and leave the rest of the house empty, and that telephone was odd. But lots of people led really weird lives. Meth drinkers, for instance. They lived in worse places than this. He'd heard of people who never threw anything away, and whose houses were piled high with drunken rubbish so that you couldn't even sit down. No, there was nothing to connect his dad with this house, except that he'd told an interesting story about it. There were high windows at either end of the attic, and Buddy went to the one that overlooked the front. There was a wooden box set into the wall below the window, and he stepped up onto it. As he wiped the dust from the window, a huge spider scuttled over the glass. He sprang back and nearly fell from the seat. The spider squeezed itself into a long crack in the wall, and Buddy leaned forward again. The sky had filled with a solid screen of black cloud, and big drops of rain were beginning to splutter the pavement. A sudden scurry of wind brought the rain beating down so heavily that the houses across the street became dim shapes. Something moved in the garden, and Buddy came to get a better view. The beast was walking fast across the lawn. "It's him!" he yelled, and all 3 of them dived for the stairs. Buddy was almost at the bottom when Julius slipped and crashed into him, knocking him forward into Charmian. They tumbled down the last couple of steps and landed in a heap. In an instant, they were all up and running across the hallway. They were halfway down the main stairs when the back door slammed. They froze and listened. There was a shuffling sound, then silence. Bloody's blood boomed in his ears. Had the beast gone into the kitchen? If he noticed that the door to the main part of the house was open, he might come up and see the broken bottle. But he leaned over the banister. He could just see the doorway that led into the kitchen. It was empty. There was a clatter of tins. He must be in the kitchen. If they could get down to the hall without making any noise, there was a chance that they could rush past the kitchen and out the back door before the beast knew what was happening. He was tiptoeing down the stairs, and the twins followed. At every step, the boards creaked terribly, no matter how carefully they trod. Bunny's hands were sticky with sweat, and he felt a trickle roll from his armpit down his side. At last they reached the bottom and began to pick their way carefully through the shattered glass. There was a loud clatter of cans. Julius made a funny, squeaking cry of fright and ran to the front door. He turned the handle and pulled, but it didn't open. Bunny stood helplessly as Julius panicked and began to rattle the door in desperation. Charmian grabbed Buddy's arm, her eyes wide with fear. The beast was coming out of the kitchen. He was carrying a knife. Buddy's first instinct was to bolt upstairs or into one of the rooms off the hall, but Charmian pulled him in the direction of the front door. Julius stopped rattling the door, and they huddled together, staring at the beast, who was now on the top step of the little flight of stairs. He was so tall that his head nearly touched the door frame. The greyish-white skin was drawn so tightly over his bones that his face looked like a skull. His black hair was roughly cut. A long strand of it flapped over his sunken red-rimmed eyes. Deep lines curved down from the sides of his mouth, his nose rather, and joined the sad creases at the edge of his mouth. His pale, moist lips opened. "What you doing? What you doing?" The beast's voice was deep, but he spoke quietly, and there was a slight pause between each word. All sorts of mad explanations through Buddy's head, but before he could say a word, he was astonished to hear Charmian's voice, loud and steady, demand, "Why did you strangle the cat?" The effect was extraordinary. Despite his size, the beast suddenly looked like a little boy. His eyes grew wide, and his lower lip began to tremble. Didn't kill him." His eyes grew wide, and his lower lip began to tremble. Oh, sorry, I read that line twice. Didn't kill him." His voice almost broke with emotion. "Found him, put him in a hole. Lady didn't want him." Buddy had never been so sure that someone was telling the truth. The reply was so direct and innocent that it couldn't be a lie. The beast suddenly looked down at the knife, and then lowered his arm and tried to hide it behind his back. "Never killed him," he said, and shook his head. "That's all right then," Charmian said more gently. "We'll go and tell the lady you didn't." There was a pause. Then she added, "Would you like that?" The beast nodded slowly, then mumbled something. "Pardon?" Charmian said. "Mr. King says no one can come in here," he said more clearly. "Well, we won't come in again. We just wanted to find out about the cat, that's all. Okay?" Charmian's voice was still very cool and controlled, but Buddy felt her tremble. "Okay?" she said again. The beast nodded. Charmian started forward, and Julius and Buddy followed her. For a moment, Buddy was worried that the beast would change his mind, but when they got to him, he stepped aside and let them pass. They walked quickly down the steps and along the corridor to the back door. Julius opened it, and he and Charmian dashed out to freedom. Buddy controlled his urge to run, and he turned when he got to the door. The beast was still standing in the hall, his head lowered as if in disgrace. "We'll tell her you didn't do it. We'll tell her you didn't do it," Buddy called. The beast didn't move. The beast. What a ridiculous name for someone as helpless looking as this man. "What's your name?" Buddy asked. "Ralph James Campbell." It was said like a child who'd learned it in case he ever got lost, and Buddy wouldn't have been surprised if he'd added his address. "Goodbye, Mr. Campbell." Buddy closed the door quietly, and despite the rain, he didn't bother to run. So the the person Buddy has known as, or briefly known as, the Beast, turns out not to be such a beast after all. Rule number one: never judge people based on what other people tell you. Mrs. Solomon, I think she was a bit of a nosy old baggage, wasn't she? I can understand she was a bit, you know, fretful and anxious, old lady living on her own, but still. Well, anyway, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed that. And Maddie and I will see you all very soon. Thank you so much for watching, subscribing, commenting. It really makes my day when you do. And I'll see you very soon. Can you wave, Maddie? Good girl. Cheerio, everybody.